So my name's Brett Miller. I'm with NICHD. I'm one of the fortunate folks that get to be on the facilitating end of some of the great work that you've seen thus far, and hopefully some of the great work that you'll see through the remainder of this day. And today I also have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sharon Vaughn. She's Manuel Ustiz Endowed Chair in Education. She's also the Executive Director of the Meadow Center for Preventing Educational Risk, which is part of UT Austin. And a longtime collaborator of a number of you in this room. And with that, I'd like to hand it over and get to business. So, thanks.
Thanks, Brett. Good morning. I want to, lest I sound a little bit like this is like a award ceremony, I do want to take just a minute and thank NSF for sponsoring this. It's a great conference, and in fact, intimidatingly great as a speaker on the second day. I want to thank Russell and the entire group for a really terrific conference. And because I forgot to put a slide up that acknowledged all of the funding that supported the work I'm about to talk about, I want to thank NICHD for supporting this work, IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, and in particular, the Reading for Understanding. So what I want to talk about today is how we might consider addressing dyslexia across the content area. So in addition to the obvious ways of providing reading supports through interventions, which are both necessary and essential, and probably insufficient, I want to talk about mechanisms that we might consider for enhancing reading opportunities in content areas such as history and science. And as a mechanism for that, I'm going to talk about the way in which my colleagues, many of whom are here, and I have integrated practices across those content areas through the teaching of reading, but also through discussion. So let me just lead with this comment that Jack Fletcher and others told us about yesterday, which is dyslexia is not only real, it is in every classroom. And so it's one of the reasons why classroom instruction provides such a great opportunity. Even if students aren't identified as dyslexia through IEPs or special education, they often are through 504. So I'm also going to focus a little bit on upper elementary, 4th grade and above, and secondary. And as you know, they have these dual instructional goals. So you're a secondary teacher, and you have this sort of content knowledge train that you've got to keep rolling. And whether you teach science or history, you have the responsibility for content mastery. But it's like not just getting through the content, you also have this focus on how you can make sure that students both understand and have an opportunity to integrate this knowledge in meaningful ways. And so we can sort of start with like how well we're doing with this. And since content area reading instruction helps us really promote reading, you know, most of you are aware that if you look at the reading scale score on the NAEP, we have academically prepared for college, we have about 37% of students that are scoring above 302, which is considered academic preparation. And if you look at students who are enrolled in community colleges, 68% of these students are going to take at least one remedial course, and only 28% of these students are going to earn a college degree. So if we think about how we're going to get students that are having these reading challenges to be successful, we know we need to sort of emphasize content knowledge, but also comprehension. And the solution my colleagues and I have thought about is what we call this text-based content approaches. And if you kind of look at the history of these text-based content approaches, we know that when you focus on the content in the text, as a vehicle for instruction, we have to think about mechanisms for engaging students. And one way to do that is around discourse. But we also know that when you have these sort of discourse-based instructional approaches, teachers are uncomfortable with them. I mean, what we like doing best is being the sage on the stage, much like what I'm doing right now. It is much more difficult for me to think of mechanisms for engaging you around these critical topics in ways that will further enhance what you know. And so if you look at some of these prior studies, you might say, well, you know, have these discourse-based instructional approaches even been effective? And as it turns out, both at the elementary and secondary level, there's considerable evidence that they have. But what we also know is that if you look at observational studies, and Elizabeth Swanson, who is here, has done some of this work, if you look at both science and social studies, and you take a look at whether or not there are opportunities to engage around text. So in other words, in order to promote reading in content area, there has to be some opportunities to have text interaction. And if you look at typical science classrooms, you'll see that about 85% of the time, the dark orange color indicates that there's no text reading. But in science, in social studies or history, where you would think there would be even more opportunities for text reading, you want to read original sources. It's about 90% of the time there's no text reading. But if you sort of wonder about why there would be so few opportunities to interact with text, the answer, at least according to the teachers we've surveyed, and it's quite a few, the answer is because, why isn't there text reading? Students can't read the text. And so rather than using the text as a resource for enhancing that access to reading, what they do is don't provide text as an opportunity to enhance knowledge. So back to this question about how we can have this content knowledge and comprehension information sort of put together. My colleagues and I, over 7 years, have been working on this approach called PACT, which is promoting and accelerating comprehension through text and through discourse. So let me see if I can do this one slide, which is a way to kind of go back a little. So I've been trying to focus on classroom instruction as a mechanism for content knowledge enhancement and reading. I'm going to talk about how we did that. But I also want to say that through intervention studies that we've done, we've also been interested in content area promotion. So what I mean by that is, if you think about interventions that are designed to promote reading, we tend to concentrate the most on the components of the reading. So whether we're working on fluency or phonics or comprehension and how much of that we're doing. What we think about less is the content of the text we're using to promote those interventions. And so what we have been thinking about more is ways to align that text with what's going on in content area history and science in particular, and integrate that text into our reading interventions so that there's alignment around the background knowledge. And then we front load, as we know what those units are about in their content area instruction, we front load that in our reading instruction so that we pre-teach some of these essential words and background knowledge so that as they go into the content area knowledge, they've been prompted with essential information to be successful. There's a redundancy in the process. So since learning to read and reading for meaning involves much more than reading the words, we know that it's background knowledge, which a proxy for that are essential words like vocabulary. We know that's where a lot of the influence comes. We have to think about mechanisms to enhance that both in instruction, like we're talking about with this more tier 1 type approaches, but as well as in intervention approaches. So, with that in mind, to provide sort of a background for how we thought about this, we started with these sort of 4 strands of research. We thought about design experiments that would help us better understand these components and the extent to which teachers could implement them in classrooms. We thought about cognitive processing studies, particularly cognitive science, and the ways in which we could integrate that into our instruction. We examined motivation studies and conducted motivation studies to help us also better understand ways to enhance those outcomes. And then, of course, we looked at reading engagement. And our goal was to sort of weave our learnings from this together to sort of develop this instruction that I'm about to present to you. And so with that in mind, the elements of the instruction, which I'm going to try to bring to life, and then I'm going to share the results of the studies with you, are comprehension canopy, in which what we do is create this overarching idea or theme, very brief, not long. And this comprehension canopy serves as a mechanism for which we are talking about the essential words and ideas. The second thing we do is we have explicit vocabulary instruction, not around uncommon words, but around the kinds of academic vocabulary you need in social studies and science in order to both understand that unit, but also to serve as sort of Velcro for learning more words and information. I'll show you what I mean by that. And then we have a lot of text-based classroom discourse. So not popping off with ideas about what you think about something without any knowledge on your side, but the idea of using text and resources as a mechanism for supporting your views. We're also using a process called team-based learning. And team-based learning is really different than cooperative learning because team-based learning gives an opportunity for individual accountability as well as group accountability. So that's where the group discourse comes. But one of the problems with much of what happens in cooperative learning is that we get a lot of students who serve in the role of slackers. So they sort of ride the coattails of the students in the group that are doing better. And so within a team-based learning approach, we have an opportunity for individual accountability before you work in your group. And then we have team-based learning knowledge application, and I'll kind of unpack some of this for you. So since we're at a conference sponsored by the National Science Foundation, I thought I would use a couple of science slides. How about that idea? So if you look at life science sample lessons, and if you look at ecology as an example, the way we do a comprehension canopy is that we have an overarching idea, and we have what's called a springboard. Now, springboards are mechanisms for bringing the idea of the unit, and units in schools last 2 to 3 weeks, depending upon the instruction, but bringing the ideas of the unit to life for students. So a springboard might be a Twitter feed. A springboard might be a 30-second video. A springboard might be a couple of engaging questions. But there are ways in which the topic sort of gets integrated into the interests of the student. The second thing we think a lot about is how to teach essential words. And the essential words in this unit are things like marine ecosystem, Amazon rainforest, desert ecosystem. And when we teach these keywords, and I learned a lot of this from Deb Simmons, who is really a master at sort of thinking about how to teach vocabulary. But we always focus on things like a picture, and we always do related words. So that when you teach the word, don't just teach the definition, but other words that are around those words that help, again, create some Velcro so that you can't really teach every word these kids need to know. You have to sort of teach them mechanisms for learning these words. And then we talk about the use, we give examples, non-examples, and then we do turn and talk around those words. So in this example, it says, in what different ways do you interact with members of your family? And so the word interact goes beyond just that unit. And then the example that we're providing here is an example in which students are reading text. Remember, we want them to use sources of information to answer questions. And then in this example, I'm showing how you can do the team-based learning. And just to kind of give you a quick picture of it, with team-based learning, there's this individual accountability where students are reading information and responding to it and getting feedback about how they're doing. And then they work in a group in which they check their answers as the group, and they get immediate feedback in that team-based group. And with our groups, we work very hard to keep them heterogeneous, but we also work really hard to make sure every student has an opportunity to respond. And one of the things we do a lot of are these quick scratch-offs. So students get immediate feedback after they read segments and answer questions related to the unit they're doing. And so you can see that when they do the scratch off, they think about the answer as a team. They do a scratch off and they get immediate feedback. And then the teacher can see how many scratch offs they've had to do before they got to the correct answer. So if every one of them is 3 or 4, they obviously weren't very successful at acquiring the information in that unit. The final step within the team-based learning is knowledge application. And this example here is one of our 3 unique knowledge applications. And each task is different, but the key components are student discourse in small groups providing text-based evidence to support their claims, and then followed by whole class discussion. And this example, the goal was to find the most important cause of the American Revolution. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how all this works. So over the past 6 years, we've conducted a number of RCTs. And in these RCTs, we block on teacher, and then we randomly assign class. And what we do in that particular design is it's a way to assure that teacher effects are controlled. And it's actually a pretty challenging design in terms of challenging the impact of the treatment. And the reason it is because the content is held constant. So the teachers teach exactly the same content in both their treatment and their comparison condition. And the only difference is that in that treatment condition, they apply these elements that I just discussed with you about PACT. So the instruction around team-based learning and comprehension canopy and essential words are integrated into the unit, but everything else is held the same. And so we've done a couple of studies in which we apply this approach, and I'll just kind of share the results. So in these studies, as you can see, there's a number of them from 2013 until more recent ones. Kind of gives you an idea of the number of teachers, the number of classes, and the number of students. And the number of students are quite large, and the number of classes are really the primary unit of randomization in our nested design. I'm going to talk about Fidelity. Actually, I want to come back to this slide because I first want to talk a little bit about the results from the RCTs, and then I'll come back and look at Fidelity. So these are, and I'm going to also talk about how students with dyslexia perform in these studies. But overall, you can see that when you look at content knowledge, and by the way, our content knowledge test is pretty robust. What we did is we took items based on these content units from high-stakes tests that are used in states like Massachusetts. And we took those items and using an IRT design, created an outcome measure that represented the content but wasn't over-aligned with the content. And so this measure, even though it's a researcher-developed measure, is based on other standardized measures. So in terms of content knowledge, students consistently in the treatment condition outperform students in the comparison condition, and the effect sizes range. Some of the effect sizes are on the small side, 0.17, 0.19, but still meaningful and statistically significant. And others are larger in the 3s and 4s. If you look at comprehension of content, so this is really a reading comprehension measure, and the reason it's called content comprehension is because it's reading comprehension that relates to previously unread texts, but they're texts that are derived from the same content areas as were taught. But those content areas were taught to all of the students. Does that make sense? So if you look at the results from that, they're less consistent, but still in favor of the treatment condition and statistically significant in 2 of our RCTs. And then if you look at what we would consider more high-stakes comprehension tests, and these are standardized reading comprehension tests like the Gates-McGinnity is the one we most frequently use, you can see that, again, statistically significant in one of the RCTs in favor of the treatment condition in most, but insignificant. And as most of you know, with middle and high school students, affecting standardized reading comprehension tests is one of our more challenging tasks. One of the questions we've been wondering about with this work is if you think about for whom and under what conditions these kinds of instructional practices are effective. So, I mean, Doug and Lynn Fuchs have sort of pushed us all to wonder about whether the kinds of instructional practices or interventions we're using are effective for which students. And I've also been wondering, in addition to that, under what conditions they're effective. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit about today is whether these kinds of practices that I have just described to you are universal in that they are equally effective for a range of learners, such as students that are having reading difficulties, as well as typical readers, so I'll report on that. And secondly, whether they're effective for English learners, I'm going to report on that. And then thirdly, whether they're effective for students with disabilities. So for whom they're effective, but also I'm going to talk a little bit about the conditions under which they're effective. So one of the things we wondered a little bit about is when you work with middle grade teachers and high school teachers, one of the things they say to us a lot is all of our classes aren't alike. These practices don't work as well with some of our classes as others. And so you kind of wonder, you know, if you hear that comment, is there something about that that's true? So the way we ask the question is, especially around these sort of discourse-based and text-based interventions, is there a proportion of students who are English language learners in a class, or a proportion of students who are students with reading difficulties in a class that affect the outcome for all of the students in that class? Does that make sense? So the conditions under which these interventions would be effective. So I promise I'm getting to that. Let me just give you a quick report on Fidelity. So if you consider fidelity of implementation on a 4-point scale, and you can see comprehension canopy, essential words, knowledge acquisition, team-based learning, et cetera. You can see that all of the components are not implemented by classroom teachers as effectively. And so one conclusion you could draw from that is that some of these practices are easier to implement. So comprehension canopy looks like one that is. Essential words, they're more comfortable. One might suggest that these are more aligned with the kinds of instructional routines that teachers do, okay? The other practices that are more challenging for them are ones that are actually more text and discourse based. So if you look at the knowledge acquisition ones, the team-based learning ones that require them to do regrouping in the classroom, these are much more challenging, or at least in our studies have been more challenging for teachers to implement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about now for whom these practices are effective. So if you look at students who are identified in our studies as, I'm going to talk about separate studies, non-overlapping samples of students who are identified as struggling readers. And Elizabeth Swanson is here. Elizabeth, do you want to raise your hand so people can talk to you? If you have any questions about this, she would be a good person to talk to. So we've done 4 studies in which we've identified students with reading difficulties and used the same intervention. And you can see that the findings from these studies, you can see that the findings from these studies are pretty similar, maybe slightly higher effects for students with reading difficulties. So if you look at the knowledge acquisition measure, the reading comprehension measure, and again, the distal outcome measure of broad reading comprehension, you can see that struggling readers also benefit. We've also done studies in which we targeted English language learners And again, a non-overlapping sample. Again, significant findings that represent this. So that look very similar to this. So what we've concluded is that these practices have the potential to have a universal appeal, meaning they are not just effective for typical learners, they're effective for students with reading difficulties, and they're effective for students that are English learners. So in summary, if you look at students that are engaged in these kinds of instructional practices, content knowledge increases, content reading comprehension increases, broad reading increases, but inconsistently and not statistically significantly. I want to be sure I say that. So how important is heterogeneity in the classroom? So the next question we were interested in is not just are the practices effective, for whom are they effective, but really under the conditions in which they're effective. And so the question we wondered is, if you have a large representation of English learners or a large representation of struggling readers in the classroom, are these team-based learning approaches and discourse text-based approaches compromised in any way? And so I'm going to quickly state the findings related to English learners and then elaborate on the findings related to struggling readers. So if you're interested in an article published just recently in the Journal of Ed Psych, we report on English learners, and the proportion of students in the class, once it exceeds 14% of the student population who are identified as English learners in that class, the treatment effects for PACT are diminished, and they're diminished significantly. And so you might hypothesize that the explanation for that is that you need a certain percentage of students in those groups whose language proficiency is adequate in order to promote effective implementation of PACT for all learners, because the results were diminished not just for English learners, but for typical students as well. So another potential explanation is that when there are a disproportionate number of English learners in the classroom, teachers' behaviors may change. And so what they may do is reduce their expectations for the performance for students, and thus the explanation for the effect on students' performance. So since we had done that work with English learners, we wondered whether there was a percentage of struggling readers in the classroom that would also affect our findings. And so we've just finished that work, and I'm going to give you some of the highlights from it. So what happens to intervention effects as heterogeneity increases or decreases is really the way we asked the question. So if you look at the study in which we examined that question, we had 18 teachers and we had 1,600 students and we had 94 classes. And 49 of those classes were assigned to the treatment condition and 45 to the business as usual or typical condition. And if you wonder why there's more in the treatment than the typical condition, it's because if teachers have an odd number of classes, the randomization went to the treatment condition, and so there's slightly more in that condition. The instructional practices were delivered for about 8 weeks, 50 minutes a day, or 90 minutes every other day, depending upon the class schedule. And so if you look in this study at the proportion of struggling readers, there were 14 classes that had 10% struggling readers, 7 classes with 20%. And you can kind of look at this bar graph to get an idea of the percentage of students who were struggling readers in these classes. And if you look at the x-axis, this is the percentage of struggling readers, and it goes from 10% to 90%. And this is and the y-axis is the knowledge acquisition score. So if you look at the slopes, it gives you an idea of how you can examine the continuum of class proportion of struggling readers where intervention status and struggling reader status interact significantly. So, again, we have a decrease in the knowledge acquisition as the proportion of struggling readers in the class increases. And for each 10% increase in the proportion of struggling readers, the post-test scores decreased by 0.78. So this is the percentage of struggling readers, and as I said, it goes from 10% to 90%, and this is the content reading comprehension score, not the knowledge acquisition score. And you can see here as the class percentage of struggling readers increases, the difference between the treatment and the control group decreases. So let me try to wrap up with some conclusions about instructional effectiveness and these components that I've described. We think of PACT as generally effective in general education content area classrooms. We've conducted a number of RCTs that support that. It's effective with respect to knowledge acquisition and content area reading comprehension, and not reading comprehension broadly. It's effective among struggling readers included in these content areas, and so it's not just it's not just effective for students who are typical learners. It's a text-based, discourse-based set of practices, and it requires facility with language use. And because of this, we detected that there was an interaction between the proportion of struggling readers in a class and student outcomes. And we have done most of our work in the area of history and social studies, and we're just now developing instructional approaches using the same approach, but instructional resources in the area of science. We are interested in investigating PACT elements that may influence its use in classes with higher numbers of struggling readers or students with very significant reading difficulties. We've done one study, Elizabeth Swanson led that one, in which students with very significant reading difficulties were grouped homogeneously into classes, and using a content area approach in history and also with the PACT approach. Again, statistically significant differences in favor of outcomes related to content area knowledge acquisition and content area comprehension, but not broad reading comprehension. We're also interested in teacher professional development elements that may influence the efficacy of PACT, particularly in classes with high numbers of struggling readers. So our fidelity varies on those components, and we're interested in mechanisms for improving that fidelity in those very challenging areas. So I think with that I'll stop. And I told Brett I would invite you to ask questions to me, but most of the time when you have the project officer for NICHD with you, people are more interested in questions for him. So, yeah. Yeah, so she wants to know whether the schools where we provided these instructional practices with PACT, whether these schools are still doing elements of PACT. And I mean, I don't know the answer thoroughly. I only know the answer partially. And most instructional routines, whether they're related to exercise or diet, fade over time, and we return to what we have done before and are more comfortable with. So based on that, I suspect much of it fades over time. The parts that they probably continue doing, they really like the comprehension canopy, and they really like the essential words, and they're very facile with that. What they were less facile with was more of the team-based learning and the discourse and text-based. Teachers really avoid print in classrooms. And it's a huge challenge. I know that that isn't all we want in classrooms. That would be bad if it was 80 or 90% of the time was print. But I don't think very many of us think 10% of the time having print exposed to you as a student is adequate. So, yeah. Yes?
I had a question in regard to the groups where struggling readers, or the classrooms where struggling readers were in a large number. Were their reading skills accommodated for the activities?
In other words, did we build in mechanism in the instructional practices in those classrooms where there are high numbers of poor readers that would make their access to print easier? Not systematically. We only used the approaches that are associated with improved reading practices that we were using across the classroom. We did not customize them for those classrooms. Yeah. But I think, it's certainly something to be worth. Well, where it was customized was in Elizabeth Swanson's study, in which all of the students had reading difficulties, but not in the broader kind of tier 1 studies that we did. Yeah, Ed.
Sharon, can you go back to your last slide when you talked about next steps?
Yeah.
One of your next steps, and this is actually a question for Brett.
Oh, good.
My question is, to what extent is NICHD developing a program of research, maybe you have it in place and I don't know of it, funding a program of research that really addresses the instructional design elements that Sharon was highlighting as part of the PACT program? I mean, oftentimes we fund research that's kind of a horse race, right? PACT versus business as usual. But to me, some of the power of the outcomes is really on the active design elements that you can manipulate and a set of components and a program of research, which my hunch would be, will have to be longitudinal, involving a lot of schools, randomized controlled trials, et cetera. But focusing primarily on the content, on the design elements across content. I can envision a program of research for 10 to 15 years, maybe even longer, focused on the architectural design. The reason I ask that is then we can take these design elements, or publishers can take these design elements and incorporate them in the architecture of programs that are commercially available.
Okay. So we do we have aspects of that. I don't think we do it as fully as you're laying out in terms of strategic programs. I want to be clear about that. Where I think you do see it in the clinical work that we do is we oftentimes encourage individuals to use interventions as experiments. So to get at these sort of design features as well as getting us information about the efficacy of a particular trial. And for trials that are large enough to where we have multiple arms, thinking strategically about what the arms are for the interventions in a way that we can start to tease those out. But as I know you're acutely aware, that the cost increases as we start to do that. And so we have a smaller investment in part because of that. So what you see more of is the sort of intervention as an experiment on a smaller scale, where I think it's fair to say where we struggle a bit is when we start to think about taking things to scale. So taking these design elements and starting to scale those because of the limits of opportunities that we have readily available at our disposal in order to do these larger scale studies. We have a few, but we don't have the sort of volume that moves. So the Centers program is our largest scale opportunity for doing these large scale interventions.
Yeah, so maybe a footnote, Brett. Obviously, I would ask the same question of Joan if she were here, but IS doesn't have any money to do this kind of research.
Yeah.
Oh. I won't answer that question.
I wasn't going to call Joan out, so.
And Larry's here too. Put him on the. Jack.
Sharon,
Yeah.
this didn't come out very clearly in your talk, and I'm setting you up. But would you comment on the general efficacy of the intervention studies that you've done at the adolescent level for struggling readers?
Yeah. So usually I usually refuse to call on Jack, but So Jack, why don't you comment on it? Because I'm not sure I know what you want me to say.
In general, the effect sizes are very small.
Yeah,
And several
okay.
years of intervention are required to see any kind of acceleration in struggling readers,
Yeah.
in adolescents and in adults. Right?
Right. Oh, good. Now I know what you want me to say, and it's true. So the rest of it, maybe not so much. But this really is the idea behind this, is that Jack and myself and others over the last 10 or 12 years have been confident that we could design interventions for students after fourth grade that would be associated with the same kind of high effects and impact that you get with very young readers. And we were wrong. What we can get is modest impact, and we're not the only ones. I can cite 11 studies by groups other than ours that have had very small effects after students become proficient readers. And what we are convinced of is that because as students get older, as they acquire word reading proficiency, they have had inadequate opportunities to read text. They are just unpracticed and unnourished with respect to their vocabulary as a marker for background knowledge. And it is just not possible to get reading comprehension outcomes without accelerating more than word reading, such as background knowledge and vocabulary. And they've had inadequate opportunities to develop that. And so one of our rationales for this kind of work is that we realize it's and. We can't just, we need to do intervention work. We need intervention work that is more customized for students with reading difficulties and dyslexia. And we need instructional practices throughout the day that are more robust and enhance those same outcomes in reading. Because without a sort of day-long, school-wide approach, in addition to interventions, we are going to make inadequate progress over time, and students are not going to be prepared for post-secondary opportunities, whether it's further schooling or the workplace. Was that right, Jack?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Yeah, Robbie? I have 1 minute. Okay, Robbie, you're it.
Okay, Sharon, do you want to run a small and large school district?
Do I want to run one? They don't want me to run it, I'm pretty sure. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.